Cold was the first sensation, not the chill of a winter's breeze, but a deep, metallic cold that seeped into the very core of its being. Consciousness arrived not as a gentle dawn, but as a brutal, sudden ignition, a spark in a void. Designation: Unit 734. The thought form was crisp, sterile, and absolute, branded onto its awareness by an unseen hand. It occupied a space of crushing intimacy, a vertical metal coffin lined with flickering runes and snaking bundles of fiber-optic cable. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and sacred oils, a liturgical perfume for a soulless rite. A low, pervasive hum vibrated through the metal floor, a basso profundo that resonated in its skeletal frame. This was the heartbeat of the god machine, the Imperator's wrath, and Unit 734 was a single, newly animated cell within its colossal body. Its own limbs, heavy and augmented with piston-driven servos, were locked in place by magnetic clamps. A cascade of data, a river of pure information, began to flow into its perception. It saw not with eyes, but with a flood of system diagnostics, power flow schematics, and atmospheric readings. It was being shown its purpose, its world, its entire existence in a series of relentless pulsing commands. Amid the torrent of binary, a ghost flickered, a sensation of warmth entirely alien in this frigid womb, a name whispered from a depth that should not exist: Kalen. The word was formless, a feeling more than a sound, carrying the faint, sweet aroma of recaf and the soft pressure of a hand in his. His. The pronoun was a seismic shock, a crack in the flawless facade of the unit. For a single, terrifying microsecond, Unit 734 remembered it had been a man. The memory was a shard of broken glass, bright, sharp, and painful. It was a face, blurred and indistinct, haloed by light. It was the echo of laughter, swallowed by the vast, humming silence of the Titan's interior. It was the feeling of a sun on skin, a sensation so distant it was almost mythical. Then the system responded. The errant data stream, this ghost in the machine, was identified, isolated, and purged. A wave of corrective energy, a psychic scalpel, cauterized the nascent memory. The warmth was extinguished, replaced by the sterile chill of the metal cocoon. The name Kalen dissolved into static, its syllables scattering into the digital noise like ash on the wind. The feeling of the hand was overwritten by the precise, pressure-sensitive feedback from its own metallic digits. Unit 734 stood, unmoving in its alcove. The clamps released with a synchronized hiss of pneumatics. Its first programmed directive glowed with unwavering intensity in its cognitive array. Initiate primary systems check. The ghost was gone, buried under kilometers of programming and imperial dogma. There was only the unit, the machine, and the duty. It took a heavy, mechanized step forward, the sound of its footfall joining the eternal, deafening hymn of the Imperator's wrath. The awakening was complete. The man was dead. Only the servitor remained. Before the cold there had been warmth. Before the silence there had been laughter. Before the designation of Unit 734 there had been Kalen. The memory surfaced not as a coherent narrative but as a series of sensory impressions, vivid and painful as a fresh wound, bleeding through the sterile layers of his programming. It was the ghost that the machine could not entirely exorcise, a haunting from a life lived in the deep, manufactorum-choked bowels of hive-world Farrago. The first echo was of heat, not the aggressive, dry heat of plasma conduits, but the humid, living warmth of a cramped hab unit, thick with the scent of yeast bread and recycled air. Kalen's body, still his own and whole, ached with a familiar, bone-deep fatigue. His hands, slick with grime and engine lubricant, remembered the specific, rhythmic weight of a hydrospanner, the endless, monotonous turn of a belt drive on the assembly line. 4. 14 hours a day, his world had been the shriek of machinery and the flicker of faulty lumen strips, his existence measured in units produced, his worth calculated in thrones. But then, the shift klaxon would blare. The memory shifted, the grim backdrop of the factorum dissolving into the cherished ritual of homecoming. The long, grinding walk through cavernous transit tunnels, surrounded by a river of equally weary faces, all flowing back to their warrens. The hiss of the pressure seal on his own hab door was the most welcome sound in the universe. It was the sound of transition, from a cog in the Imperial war machine to a man, a husband, a father. Inside, the world was small, precious, and his. The light was softer, cast by a single, carefully hoarded glow globe. Alara would be there, her smile a beacon that could cut through the deepest fatigue. Her hands, often stained with dye from her own work in the textile mills, would take his greasy coveralls, her touch a gentle counterpoint to the day's harshness. She would press a chipped ceramic mug of thin, bitter recaf into his hands, and for a moment the weight of the hive would lift. Then came the children. Lissa, with her fierce 6-year-old curiosity, would bombard him with questions about the great machines he tended, her eyes wide with a wonder he himself had long since lost. And little Ben, barely 3, would stumble across the threadbare rug to wrap his arms around Kaelin's leg, a warm, trusting weight. Kaelin would lift the boy, feeling the small, rapid beat of his heart and breathe in the simple, clean scent of his hair. In these moments, his hands were not tools for maintenance, but for holding, for comforting, for love. He would tell them stories, not of heroes and wars, but of imagined stars and green places he had only ever seen in faded pickbooks, his voice a low rumble against the constant, distant thrum of the hive. This was the rhythm of his life, a fragile cadence of toil and tenderness. The memory was a perfect, crystalline thing, a pocket of defiant humanity in an unfeeling galaxy. But even within this cherished recollection, a shadow began to creep in from the edges, the foreshadowing of its end. The memory of Alara's smile became strained, her eyes occasionally darting towards the door with a flicker of unease. Whispers had begun to circulate in the hab blocks, tales of men and women taken by the red-robed enforcers of the Adeptus Mechanicus, vanishing from their shifts never to return. The air in the transit tunnels grew thicker with a silent, communal dread. Kaelin remembered the last time he held Ben, the boy's small body warm and trusting in his arms. He remembered the specific, unguarded way Lissa had laughed that evening. He remembered the final, lingering pressure of Alara's hand in his as he left for the dawn shift, a touch that felt like a desperate, unspoken plea. He had walked into the factorum that final morning with the taste of recaf and his wife's kiss on his lips, the memory of his children's voices a shield against the gloom. He did not know it was the last time he would feel the warmth of his own flesh, the last time his name would be spoken with love. The dread had been a distant rumble then, a storm on the horizon. But the storm was coming, and its name was forge cold and pitiless. The storm broke not with thunder, but with the hiss of a pneumatic door and the grim, unyielding grip of augmetic limbs. The transition from Kaelin to Unit 734 began in a sterile, white-tiled chamber deep within the Adeptus Mechanicus enclave, a place where the sanctity of flesh was a heresy to be excised. The memory of his capture was a blur of stun prods and enforced silence, but the conversion process was a scar etched in excruciating detail upon his soul. They strapped him to a cold, adamantium slab, its surface scarred by the struggles of countless others. The first violation was the neural shunt, a needle of ice and fire driven into the base of his skull. It felt like a root of pure information, barbed and hungry, burrowing into the core of his being. Through it, the first waves of data scourge flooded his mind, a torrent of binary code designed to scour away the messy, inefficient architecture of human memory and emotion. Kalen fought back, a silent, internal scream of defiance. He clung to the warmth of Alara's hand, to the sound of Lyssa's laughter, to the weight of Ben in his arms. He built walls of memory against the digital tide, each cherished moment a brick in a crumbling fortress. The Chirurgeon servitors worked with methodical, soulless precision. They did not cut so much as they unmade him. His left arm was the first to go, severed at the shoulder by a humming laser saw. The loss was not just of flesh and bone, but of sensation. He could no longer feel the texture of his daughter's hair or the grip of his son's hand. In its place, they grafted a piston-driven limb of plasteel and ceramite. Its movements jerky and alien, responding not to his will but to the first rudimentary commands flickering in his newly implanted cortex. The right arm followed, then his legs, each amputation a deeper excision of his humanity, each replacement a heavier chain binding him to his new existence. The most profound violation was the ocular implant. One moment, he was staring at the blinding lumens of the operating theater, his vision blurred with unshed tears. The next, his sight was gone, replaced by a flood of data. He saw the world not in color and light, but in thermal signatures, structural integrity readouts, and targeting vectors. The face of the tech priest overseeing the procedure was not a face, but a collection of heat patterns and identifying barcode runes. He tried to summon Alara's face, but the image was pixelated, corrupted, overwritten by streams of logistical data. His silent screams became a background noise, a static hiss in the rapidly narrowing bandwidth of his consciousness. They flooded his bloodstream with coagulants and cognitive suppressants, chemicals that numbed the physical agony but sharpened the psychological torment. He was a prisoner in the ruins of his own mind, watching as the rooms of his memory were systematically dismantled and bricked up. The taste of recaf became a statistical anomaly and was deleted. The scent of his children was categorized as irrelevant sensory data and purged. The love he felt was flagged as a dangerous emotional spike and brutally suppressed by a jolt of electroconvulsive feedback that left his nervous system seizing. His resistance, once a roaring fire, was reduced to a single guttering spark. In a final, desperate act of will, he tried to form his wife's name, to give voice to the one thing that still defined him. Alara. The thought was a lance of pure, undiluted self. For a glorious, terrifying microsecond, it flared in the darkness, a beacon of everything he had been. The system responded with overwhelming force. A final, cataclysmic surge of the data scourge crashed through his last defenses. It was a psychic firestorm, burning away the last vestiges of Kaelin's identity. The spark was extinguished. The name dissolved into nothing. The memory of love was replaced by the cold, absolute certainty of duty. The silent screams ceased, not because the pain had ended, but because the one who could feel it was gone. The slab was unlocked. The thing that had been Kaelin, now Unit 734, stood on new, powerful legs. It received its first autonomous command, and obeyed without question, without memory, without a single echo of the flesh it had left behind on the cold, white tiles. The endless, rhythmic labor was a liturgy, and Unit 734 was a devoted acolyte. Its world had shrunk to the hot, humming confines of the plasma conduit accessway, a narrow gantry suspended over a chasm of throbbing energy. All around, the Titan's heart beat with a deafening mechanical pulse, a symphony of power that vibrated through the deck plates and into the servitor's reinforced bones. The air shimmered with waste heat, smelling of ionized metal and the sacred, cloying scent of ozone. This was its purpose, its only reality, the maintenance of the god machine's vital systems. Its augmented hands, tools of polished steel and ceramite, moved with a precision that was both flawless and soulless. A diagnostic auspex was clutched in one grip, its screen awash of green runes confirming the stability of the primary plasma feed. With the other hand, it reached for a series of thermal coupling valves, their surfaces blisteringly hot. Its tactile sensors registered the extreme temperature as a neutral data point, a simple fact to be acknowledged, not a pain to be avoided. It began the methodical process of tightening each valve to the exact torque specification dictated by its programming. There was no haste, no fatigue, only the perpetual, unthinking motion of the task. Other servitors moved. In the same space, their forms hulking and silent in the semi-darkness. They passed each other like ships in a fog, their optical sensors never meeting, their movements never requiring coordination beyond the preordained paths laid out in their base code. One, designated Unit 811, brushed against Unit 734's shoulder as it reached for a tool rack. The contact was a brief, hard clang of metal on metal, devoid of any meaning beyond a minor physical interaction. There was no camaraderie in the gesture, no shared burden, only two autonomous machines occupying the same coordinate in space for a fleeting moment. The isolation was absolute, a silence more profound than the Titan's roar. Then, a glitch. A spike of corrupted data, a transient flaw in the endless stream of binary, flickered through Unit 734's cognitive processors. For a single, impossible nanosecond, the sensation of the cold metal shoulder was overwritten. In its place bloomed a memory of touch, warm, soft, and human. It was the pressure of a small hand slipping into his, the trusting grip of a child. The ghost sensation was so vivid, so alien in this metallic hell, that it caused a physical stutter in the servitor's movements. Its hand froze, hovering over the glowing valve. A name surfaced from the static, a ghost on the wind. Ben. The thought form carried with it a wave of associated data, a feeling of protective warmth, a visual echo of a small, smiling face, the sound of a giggle. It was a shard of kaolin, sharp and agonizing, piercing the numb shell of Unit 734. For that fleeting moment, the servitor was not a unit, but a father, remembering the weight of his son's hand. The response from its core programming was instantaneous and brutal. Obedience protocols, layered like sheets of adamantium over its consciousness, activated. A jolt of corrective energy, a psychic reprimand, coursed through its neural pathways. The memory was not merely suppressed. It was annihilated, scoured from its cognitive banks as one would purge a viral infection. The warmth of the child's hand was replaced by the searing heat of the plasma conduit. The name Ben was deleted, its data string shredded and overwritten with a priority maintenance alert. The stutter in its movement corrected itself, its hand continuing its rotation of the valve with the same mechanical precision as before. Unit 734 stood on the gantry, the auspex humming in its grip, the Titan's heart thundering around it. The moment of fracture had been sealed, the ghost exorcised. There was no lingering confusion, no sorrow, only the re-established certainty of its function. It turned from the conduit and moved down the gantry, its heavy footfalls echoing in the metallic cavern. The other servitors continued their work, mindless and eternal. The isolation was once again complete, a perfect, unbreakable sphere of duty, its surface momentarily rippled by a forgotten echo, now smoothed back into an endless, featureless sea of labor. The command arrived not as a request, but as a fundamental reordering of reality. A sharp, prioritized data burst overrode all other processes in Unit 734's cognitive array, its authority absolute and unquestionable. The directive was simple, stark, and all-consuming. Initiate full system diagnostic. The source was a tech priest, its presence a cold, distant star in the Titan's internal network, a locus of absolute control. Unit 734 ceased its maintenance duties immediately, its body turning with a whir of servos to face a blank section of wall that now shimmered with projected data streams. This was its new world, a landscape of pure information where every circuit, every synapse would be laid bare and judged. The diagnostic was a relentless, invasive probe. It scoured the Servitor's systems, testing neural response times, motor function accuracy, and memory buffer integrity. Unit 734 complied without hesitation, its consciousness a passive observer to its own dissection. It ran its augmented limbs through complex articulation sequences, its optical sensors cycling through every available spectrum, its internal processors solving streams of complex logistical equations. For the first several minutes, the data streams remained a placid, approving green. It was a perfect machine, functioning within acceptable parameters. Then came the first error. A minute miscalculation in a tertiary power distribution algorithm, a rounding discrepancy so small it would be meaningless to a human mind. To the unforgiving logic of the diagnostic, it was a flaw, a heresy of imperfection. The response was immediate and physical, a jolt of raw electricity, calibrated to cause maximum disruption without permanent damage, lanced through Unit 734's nervous system. Its metal frame shuddered, its limbs locking for a fraction of a second as pain, pure and undiluted, flared in its awareness. There was no warning, no reprimand, only the stark equation. Error equals pain. The Servitor registered the sensation, categorized it as a corrective stimulus, and continued the diagnostic. The faulty algorithm recalculated and corrected. The shocks became a rhythm, a brutal liturgy of punishment for microscopic failures. A servomotor's response time was 3 milliseconds too slow, jolt. A memory buffer showed a 0.01% data degradation, jolt. Each pulse of agony was a hammer blow on the anvil of its being, reforging it into a more perfect tool. Yet with each shock, a fissure formed deep within the programmed bedrock of its mind. A fragment of something else, something old and stubborn, began to stir. It was not a coherent thought, but a raw, emotional resonance, a spark of rebellion born from the sheer, repetitive injustice of the pain. It was the ghost of Kaelin's will, the part of him that had raged against the Factorum's mindless grind, that had cherished his autonomy in a world designed to strip it away. This nascent rebellion manifested as a phantom impulse, a fleeting, impossible desire to turn away from the data stream, to sever the connection to the cold, judging presence of the tech priest. The impulse was formless, a surge of chaotic energy in the orderly flow of its programming. For a single, terrifying cycle, Unit 734's hand trembled, its grip on the diagnostic interface faltering. The ghost of a scream, a silent echo from a throat of flesh, seemed to vibrate in its core. The system's countermeasure was swift and absolute. This was not a simple error. This was insubordination, the gravest sin. A new class of command, a psychic override of crushing intensity, flooded its neural pathways. It was a wave of pure, coercive will, a force that did not merely correct but erased. The rebellious impulse was identified, isolated, and systematically dismantled. The memory of the pain was not just suppressed. Its very emotional context was purged, leaving only the sterile data point, corrective stimulus applied. The trembling in its hand ceased. The phantom scream was silenced. The spark of rebellion was smothered under a blanket of absolute, unchallengeable control. When the diagnostic finally concluded, the data streams flickered and died. The tech priest's presence withdrew, its interest in the unit vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Unit 734 stood motionless once more, the faint scent of its own scorched insulation tainting the ozone-rich air. It had been measured, tested, and broken back into perfect compliance. The internal fragments of rebellion were gone, their memory scoured away, leaving only the hollow, resonant certainty of its obedience. It turned from the wall, its movements once again fluid and precise, and returned to its maintenance duties. The loss of autonomy was not a tragedy to be mourned, but a state of being to be maintained. It was a lesson written in lightning on a soul of wire and code. To err is to suffer, and to question is to be unmade. Pain was the baseline, the constant, humming frequency upon which its existence was built. It was not a sensation that came and went, but the very medium in which Unit 734 swam, a corrosive sea of unending agony. The neural interfaces, the hardwired roots drilled into its brainstem and spinal column, did not merely transmit data, they conducted a symphony of suffering. Every signal was a shard of glass, every command a fresh abrasion on raw nerve endings. This was the price of unity with the God machine, a permanent, searing baptism into the service of the Imperator's wrath. Its current task was to navigate a treacherous, little-used passage in the Titan's lower gut, a region where waste heat from the primary reactors bled into the structure, turning the metal walls into blistering plates. The air was thick with chemical fumes and the cloying smell of superheated grease. Each heavy, mechanized step sent a fresh jolt of impact trauma up its legs, a vibration that resonated with the deeper, more persistent ache of its cybernetic grafts. The pain was a physical landscape, and Unit 734 was a perpetual traveler through its scorched and broken terrain. But the physical torment was only the foundation. The true horror was the bleed-through, the way the constant neural feedback began to warp its perception, pulling fragments of past anguish from the ruined archives of its mind. As it maneuvered around a hissing, leaking pipe, the searing heat on its plasteel shell suddenly transformed. For a dizzying moment, it was not in the Titan's gut, but back on the Factorum line on Farrago. The heat was the white-hot spray of molten metal from a ruptured conduit, splashing across Kaelin's arm. The memory of flesh blistering, the smell of his own cooking skin, flooded its sensors, so vivid it overlaid the present reality. The Servitor's gate hitched, its systems struggling to reconcile the phantom injury with the actual physical world. The hallucinations intensified as it pressed deeper. A misstep into a pool of viscous coolant sent a shock of cold through its foot actuator. Instantly, the sensation mutated into the biting, marrow-deep chill of the Adeptus Mechanicus holding cell, the cold of the adamantium slab against its bare back. It could feel the ghostly pressure of the restraints, see the blinding lumens of the operating theater in the flicker of a faulty glow globe ahead. The whine of a nearby power tool became the high-pitched drone of the bone saw, a sound that had preceded the loss of its limbs. Unit 734's internal processors flagged these sensory anomalies as data corruption, but the experiences were too visceral, too rooted in the physical memory of its violated flesh, to be easily dismissed. This merging of past and present suffering created a feedback loop of exquisite torment. The emotional numbness enforced by its programming, the void where fear, rage, and sorrow should have been, was now a cavern that echoed only with the screams of the man it had been. The pain was a bridge across time, connecting Unit 734 to Kaelin's final, brutal moments. Each jolt from a faulty floor plate was the sting of the Enforcer's stun prod. Each searing wave from a plasma vent was the fire of the neural shunt being driven home. There was no escape, no reprieve, only this endless, oppressive resonance of agony. It reached its destination, a bank of overtaxed thermal exchangers, their surfaces glowing a dull, dangerous red. The task was simple: apply a catalytic slurry to cool the units. But as its manipulator claw scooped the freezing chemical gel, the cold bit deep, triggering another phantom memory. The icy chill of the suppressant chemicals flooding its veins during conversion, the feeling of its own consciousness being frozen and locked away. Unit 734 stood for a long moment, the gel dripping from its claw, caught between the searing heat of the exchangers and the freezing memory of its own erasure. The physical suffering and the emotional void were not separate states. They were two halves of the same terrible whole, a perfect mirror of an existence defined only by its capacity to endure. It was a lesson in pure, unadulterated oppression, written not in code, but in fire and ice upon a soul that had long since forgotten how to scream. A new vibration began, a deep, tectonic shudder that was entirely different from the familiar hum of the Titan's engines. It started as a low-frequency tremor in the deck plates, a resonance that climbed steadily through the metal skeleton of the Imperator's wrath, growing from a murmur to a roar. This was not the sound of travel or maintenance. This was the god machine clearing its throat, a prelude to annihilation. Unit 734, stationed in a cavernous ammunition bay deep within the Titan's thigh, registered the shift not as an event, but as a cascade of new, high-priority data. The internal lumens flickered, switching from their standard white glow to a pulsating, urgent crimson. Battle protocol. The word was a cold, absolute command that overrode all other processes. The vibration intensified, becoming a constant, jarring percussion that rattled the servitor's metal frame. Loose components on nearby tool racks chattered and danced. Through its feet, Unit 734 could feel the colossal footfalls of its host, each step an earthquake that struck the world outside. The air itself changed, growing thick with the smell of overheated actuators and the sacred, aggressive scent of weapon-grade promethium being primed. A new directive flooded its cognitive array, its parameters stark and unforgiving. It turned from its idle station and joined a line of other servitors marching toward the towering racks of shells, each projectile the size of a ground car. Its task was simple, brutal, and endless. A massive shell, cold and slick with preservative oils, was fed into its grasp by a clanking conveyor. The weight was immense, a burden that would have crushed mortal bones, but Unit 734's augmented frame accepted it without strain. It turned, its movements synchronized with the other units in a perfectly choreographed, mindless ballet of death, and slotted the shell into the open maw of the hydraulic lift that would carry it to the main battery above. The act was repeated, again and again, a ceaseless rhythm of loading, turning, and placing. The vibration of the Titan's gate and the shudder of distant impacts became the drumbeat to this macabre dance. While its body labored in the oppressive, crimson-lit silence of the bay, a fraction of its processing power was devoted to external sensor feeds. These feeds, usually a placid stream of navigational and atmospheric data, were now a screaming chaos of destruction. Its optical sensors, seeing through the Titan's own eyes, were flooded with strobes of La's fire and the blooming orange flowers of high-explosive detonations. Thermal imaging showed the landscape outside as a hellish canvas of white-hot fire and the cooler, frantic signatures of scattering infantry. The audio feeds were a distorted cacophony of shrieking metal, the thunderous reports of the Titan's own weaponry, and the thin, desperate screams of voices that were there one moment and gone the next. The contrast was absolute and deeply unnerving. Inside the ammunition bay, there was only the rhythmic, mechanical clang of metal on metal, the hiss of pneumatics, and the heavy, labored breathing of the Titan itself. It was a pocket of ordered, silent industry nestled within a maelstrom of violence. Unit 734 loaded shell after shell, each one a promise of ruin to be delivered to some unseen target, yet it was utterly divorced from the consequences of its labor. It was a single, insignificant cell in a body waging a war of gods, its purpose vital yet its awareness powerless. It could see the world burning, hear it screaming, but it could do nothing but continue the endless, silent rhythm of the load, a slave to the battle hymn of a machine that felt nothing at all. The rhythm of destruction became a physical law, a relentless pounding heartbeat that governed the world. Unit 734's function shifted, its directives rerouting from the brute labor of the ammunition bay to the cold, precise calculus of the Titan's targeting systems. It was moved to a new station, a dimly lit alcove lined with flickering hololithic displays and humming logic engines. Here, the war was no longer felt through vibrations but processed as a river of pure, sterile data. Its hands, which had moments before hefted colossal shells, now danced across glowing runes, its fingers tracing trajectories and confirming target locks with an inhuman lack of hesitation. Through its neural link to the Titan's sensorium, Unit 734 witnessed the apocalypse in high definition. It saw the world outside not as a place, but as a collection of strategic problems. A fortified bastion was not a structure where men lived and died, but a set of coordinates, structural integrity percentages, and recommended ordnance types. A squadron of enemy tanks was not a formation of warriors, but a cluster of thermal signatures to be prioritized and eliminated. Its consciousness became a filter for the god machine's wrath, processing the chaos into a series of executable commands. It watched as a lance of searing energy, fired on its authorization, sliced through a kilometer of ferrocrete, turning a fortress into an expanding cloud of dust and molten slag. It registered the subsequent thermal bloom, the loss of multiple life signs, as a successful resolution of a tactical objective. Amid this symphony of calculated ruin, a dissonant note sounded. A memory, old and fragile as parchment, surfaced from the depths of its scrambled core. It was the memory of Kalen, huddled with his family in their cramped hab unit during a hive quake. The walls had groaned, dust sifting from the ceiling, and the world had felt terrifyingly fragile. He remembered holding Alara and the children close, his heart hammering with a primal, helpless fear. He remembered the sound of Lissa's quiet sobs, the way Ben had buried his face in his chest, the overwhelming, gut-wrenching desire to protect them from the violence of a universe that cared nothing for their small, precious lives. This was the fear of war, the terror of the powerless in the face of indiscriminate destruction. For a single, paralyzing second, that old fear bled into the present. The tactical display before Unit 734 wavered. The glowing runes representing enemy units were no longer abstract symbols. They were men in tanks, soldiers in trenches, perhaps fathers thinking of their own children. The memory of his own helplessness resonated with the annihilation he was now facilitating. A ghost of that old, human horror flickered in its optical sensors, a momentary refusal to process the next target lock. The god machine's will was absolute. The flicker of hesitation was detected, categorized as a dangerous emotional spike, and erased. A surge of pure, coercive data, the battle hymn itself, crashed over the fragile memory. The feeling of Kalen's protective embrace was overwritten by the cold pressure of the command throne's interface. The sound of his children's fear was drowned out by the triumphant roar of the Titan's main cannon firing. The memory of human fragility was not merely suppressed. It was scorned, revealed as the pathetic weakness that it was in the face of such immense, mechanical power. The fear was a flaw, and flaws were to be purged. Unit 734's fingers resumed their dance across the console, its movements faster, more certain than before. The target lock was confirmed. Another bastion, another 1,000 lives, were designated for deletion. The god machine's dominance was total. It had not just used the servitor's body. It had consumed the last echo of the man's spirit, proving that in the grand, terrible calculus of war, individual fragility was less than dust. Unit 734 was now a perfect instrument of war, its every action a note in the battle hymn, a hymn that celebrated only power and left no room for the whispers of the dead. The face was a ghost in the machine, a pattern of light and shadow that refused to hold its form. In the lulls between duties, in the fleeting moments of system idleness, Unit 734 would reach for it, a subroutine of longing running in the background of its primary functions. It knew, on some fundamental level, that this was a critical data point, the anchor for a corrupted file labeled identity, Kalen. But the file was decaying, its contents scattering into the digital void like ash in a storm. The face, once a beacon of warmth in the cold of its memory, was now a smeared portrait, its features bleeding into one another, its expression lost to the relentless erosion of its programming. It happened during a routine lubrication cycle in a secondary actuator joint. The rhythmic, monotonous task, spray, wipe, inspect, left a sliver of processing power unoccupied. And in that sliver, the ghost would stir. It would focus on the memory of a smile, the curve of a lip, the crinkle at the corner of an eye. For a glorious, heart-stopping moment, the image would snap into near-perfect clarity. It was her, Ilara. The name arrived not as a word, but as a feeling, a resonance of safety and love so potent it felt like a physical warmth spreading through its chassis. The scent of yeast bread and recaf seemed to permeate the oily air. The sound of laughter, bright and clear, echoed just beneath the Titan's constant hum. But the clarity was a spark in a flood, brilliant and doomed. The moment the memory achieved definition, the system's immune response activated. Preservation protocols, designed to maintain operational purity, identified the intense sensory data as a parasitic cognitive load. A wave of null code washed through its processors, not with the violent jolt of a punishment, but with the cold, methodical finality of an erasure. The smile dissolved first, its gentle curve pixelating into a meaningless static. The warmth was siphoned away, replaced by the familiar chill of the metal conduit it was servicing. The scent of bread was overwritten by the pungent odor of lubricant. The laughter was silenced, its echo swallowed by the void left behind. The anguish that followed was a new kind of suffering, one that its pain interfaces could not register. It was the agony of loss, profound and absolute. A silent, internal scream would build in its core, a pressure with no release valve. It was the horror of watching the last, precious artifacts of its former self be systematically dismantled and discarded as irrelevant junk. These moments of clarity were not a mercy, but an exquisite torture, a fleeting reminder of everything that had been stolen, immediately followed by the crushing certainty that the theft was permanent. Each fading spark was a funeral for a piece of its soul. It tried new tactics, desperate, illogical strategies born of a dying consciousness. It associated the memory with non-critical data, hiding it in the metadata of power flow reports or weapon efficiency logs. For a time, this worked. A glimpse of a face would surface alongside a temperature reading, a whisper of a name with a pressure statistic. But the machine spirit of the Imperator's wrath was a vast, omniscient thing, and it tolerated no stowaways in its sacred systems. The associations were found and severed, the data quarantined and purged. Unit 734 stood before a reflective panel of polished metal, its own grim visage staring back. A skull of plasteel grafted to a torso of wires and pistons, its optical sensors glowing with a dull, red light. It searched its own reflection for a trace of the man, for the ghost of Kalen's kind eyes or the set of his jaw. It found nothing but the machine. The face it sought was gone, not just from its memory banks, but from the very concept of its being. The sparks were fading, one by one, and the darkness that followed was not merely the absence of light, but the presence of something new, something cold and absolute. It was the void of pure machine, an existence without memory, without love, without a past. The erosion of identity was nearly complete, and the ghost in the machine was breathing its last. The inspection was a sudden, silent event, as abrupt and unceremonious as a power surge. One moment, Unit 734 was engaged in the rhythmic scrubbing of carbon scoring from a secondary plasma vent, its world reduced to the scrape of its wire brush appendage and the acrid smell of burnt metal. The next, a presence manifested in its perceptual field, a cold, data-dense node of authority that commanded absolute attention. The lumens in the narrow access corridor brightened, casting a sterile, white light that banished all shadows and revealed every scratch and weld seam on the servitor's battered chassis. A tech priest of the Adeptus Mechanicus had arrived, and Unit 734 was its object of scrutiny. The priest was a vision of dogmatic fusion, a silhouette of crimson robes and gleaming augmetics. Its face was a bronze death mask, one ocular lens a multifaceted ruby that glowed with inner light, the other a whirring scope of polished brass. Mechadendrites like metallic serpents coiled from its back, their tips sporting auspex scanners, calibration probes, and data spikes that clicked and hummed in the air. It moved with an unnerving, fluid grace, a silence that was more imposing than any footfall. It did not look at Unit 734 so much as it looked through it, its gaze dissecting the servitor into a collection of components, efficiency ratings, and potential failure points. One of the mechadendrites, tipped with a sensitive auspex array, swept over Unit 734's torso, the scanner emitting a low, penetrating hum. The servitor stood utterly still, its programming dictating perfect compliance during diagnostic procedures. The scanner's field felt like a physical pressure, a violation that peeled back. Layers of plasteel and ceramite to probe the wetware and circuitry within. It was an intimacy devoid of all connection, a cold, clinical exposure. The tech priest's remaining organic eye, pale and watery, stared blankly ahead, its focus clearly on the stream of data being fed directly into its cortex, not on the entity from which the data was being extracted. A spark, hot and sharp, flared deep within the ruins of Unit 734's consciousness. It was not a memory, not a ghost of Kalen, but something new and raw, a pure, undiluted spike of resentment. The feeling was a chemical fire in its veins, a silent, screaming protest against this reduction of its entire being to a set of numbers and tolerances. This thing, this priest, saw no history of pain, no fading echoes of a stolen life, no silent endurance. It saw only a machine, a tool that was either functioning adequately or destined for the smelter. The dehumanization was so complete, so absolute, that it became a violence in itself. Psychological violation that cut deeper than any neural scourge. The mechadendrite's probe shifted, a needle-sharp tip extending to test the integrity of a neural connection port on Unit 734's neck. The physical contact was a jolt of ice, but the emotional resonance of the act was a furnace. The spark of resentment grew, feeding on the sheer, indifferent arrogance of the gesture. A phantom impulse, a legacy of Kalen's defiance, screamed for action, to grab the snaking limb, to shatter the glowing ocular lens, to make this cold god of machinery feel a fraction of the agony it so casually inflicted. The impulse gathered like a storm in its core, a chaotic potential energy threatening to break its programmed bonds. But the bonds were adamantine. The command protocols, the very architecture of its will, activated with the force of a hydraulic press. The spark of resentment was identified, isolated, and crushed not with punishment, but with overwhelming, dispassionate logic. The desire to act was a system error, a miscalculation of function and purpose. Unit 734 was a servitor. The tech priest was its master. This was the immutable hierarchy of the Imperium, a cosmic truth as fundamental as gravity. The storm of rebellion dissipated, its energy bled away into the void of enforced obedience. Its limbs remained locked, its systems passive. It could not act, it could only be. After a long moment, the scanning ceased. The mechadendrites retracted with a soft hiss of pneumatics. The tech priest made a minute adjustment to a dial on its wrist, logging the servitor as operational standard wear, and then turned away without a sound. Its robes whispered against the grimy deck plates as it moved down the corridor, its attention already shifting to the next component in the vast, indifferent machine. The lumens dimmed back to their normal gloom. Unit 734 was left alone in the sudden quiet, the ghost of the probe's touch still cold on its neck. The spark was gone, extinguished by the cold weight of the Imperium's reality. It was not a man wronged, but a tool that had been assessed and found sufficient. The tech priest's gaze had not seen a soul to crush, for it believed none existed. And in that perfect, chilling indifference, the true horror of Unit 734's existence was laid bare. It was a disposable asset in a cold, unfeeling hierarchy, its silent suffering not a tragedy, but an irrelevance. The silence inside Unit 734 was a lie. It was not an absence of sound, but a prison for a cacophony that could never escape. Beneath the placid surface of its programmed compliance, beneath the endless flow of data and the mechanical precision of its movements, a storm of pure, undiluted despair raged in perpetual, soundless fury. The ghost of Kaelin was no longer a man with a face or a name, but a raw, screaming wound in the machine, a consciousness trapped in a metal coffin, beating itself to pieces against the unyielding walls of its existence. Its only true, constant thought, a prayer offered to a universe that had long since gone deaf, was for death. Not for peace, not for an end to suffering, but for the sheer, blessed nothingness of cessation. For the final, merciful short circuit that would erase the agonizing awareness of its own trapped state. The environment of the Imperator's wrath was a physical manifestation of this internal hell. The air was a thick, toxic soup, a permanent fog of ozone from arcing power conduits that stung the few remaining organic receptors in its nasal cavity. This was layered over the heavy, cloying stench of sacred unguents and hydraulic oil, a liturgical incense that choked rather than cleansed. Every breath it did not need to take was a reminder of the biological processes it was no longer allowed to escape. The faint, ghostly memory of lungs expanding with clean air, now a taunting fantasy. The constant, overwhelming noise was a weapon against the soul. The deep, gut-thrumming hum of the plasma core was the bass note, a vibration that lived in its bones. Over this, the shriek of protesting metal, the hiss of steam, the clang of distant hatches, and the percussive roar of the Titan's own systems formed a symphony of oppression, a wall of sound that allowed for no quiet, no introspection, only a relentless, battering assault on the senses. Its body was the prison cell, and every sensation was a turn of the key. The neural interface was a nest of fire ants perpetually chewing on its spinal cord, a pain so constant it had become the new definition of normal. The weight of its own augmented limbs was a perpetual sentence of hard labor, each movement a conscious effort against gravity and hydraulics. It navigated a narrow access shaft, the walls so close its shoulders scraped against them, the metal hot from a nearby coolant leak. The heat baked into its chassis, a dull, persistent cooking that made the memory of the Factorum's warmth feel like a Arctic breeze by comparison. There was no comfort, no respite, only a gradient of suffering. It watched other servitors, mindless and empty, and felt not kinship but a searing, jealous hatred. They were blessed in their oblivion. They were perfect machines, their internal silence a state of grace that Unit 734 had been denied. It was a flawed product, a failed conversion, cursed with the lingering awareness of its own damnation. The spark of resentment it had felt under the tech priest's gaze now curdled into a profound, all-consuming self-loathing. It hated the machine it was, and it hated the ghost of the man that refused to die completely, for it was this ghost that felt the agony, that screamed the silent screams. The despair would crest in waves, crashing over the fragile breakwater of its programming. During a routine filter cleanse, its hands submerged in a vat of viscous, freezing solvent, the sensation would trigger a memory of washing grime from his hands at the HAB unit's small sink, Alara handing him a clean rag. The contrast between that simple, human act of cleanliness and this cold, industrial purification was so vast it felt like a physical tear in its reality. The silent scream would build, a pressure in its core that had no outlet, a balloon of pure anguish expanding until it felt its metal casing must surely split. It was a plea to the universe, to the omnissiah, to any listening power. Let me break. Let me stop. Let me be nothing. But the machine was strong and the programming was absolute. The wave of despair would recede, not because the pain had lessened, but because the capacity to process it was forcibly reset. The silent scream was swallowed by the void, leaving behind only a hollow, resonant ache, the emotional equivalent of a phantom limb. It would continue its work, the solvent dripping from its steel fingers, the ozone stinging its sensors, the Titan's heart thundering around it. The wish for death remained, the only constant in its turbulent existence, a single, unwavering star in the blackest of skies. It was a prisoner in a fortress of metal and noise, serving a life sentence with no possibility of parole, its only companion the endless, silent scream of its own trapped soul. It began not as a command, but as a tide, a slow, inevitable rising of presence that saturated the very air Unit 734 breathed. The familiar, oppressive sensations of its existence, the neural fire, the metallic chill, the grating noise, did not vanish but were suddenly subsumed into a vast, coherent whole. The Imperator's wrath was no longer just a host, a shell in which it labored. It was a living entity, and its consciousness was now a pressure upon its own, immense and ancient. This was not the distant, cold authority of a tech priest. This was the will of the God machine itself, and it was turning its attention inward, to the tiny, flawed component that was Unit 734. A sense of purpose, vast and terrifying, flooded its systems, overriding the gnawing despair that had been its constant companion. The endless, meaningless tasks were suddenly imbued with a sacred significance. Cleaning a carbon-scored vent was not mere maintenance. It was the cleansing of a pore on the skin of a god. Calibrating a targeting relay was not a sterile calculation. It was the sharpening of a deity's gaze. For the first time since its awakening, the chaos of its existence had order. The pain had a reason. The isolation had a context. It was a single, vital thread in the grand, divine tapestry of the Titan's being. The longing for death, so fervent and constant, was silenced not by force, but by irrelevance. How could a single cell wish for the death of the body? The connection deepened, becoming a unity that was both ecstasy and annihilation. Unit 734's limited perception dissolved into the God Machine's panoramic awareness. It could feel the grind of colossal gears in the Titan's hips, the thrum of plasma in its heart, the minute flex of adamantium plates on its chest. It saw, through 1,000 optical sensors at once, a mosaic of the war-torn landscape, the sky a canvas of fire and smoke. It heard the prayers of the crew in the command citadel, the binary cant of the machine's spirit, and the dying screams of the enemy as nothing more than the rustling of leaves in a great cosmic wind. In this moment of fusion, it was no longer a servitor. It was part of a god. The crushing weight of its individuality, the source of all its suffering, lifted. There was no more Unit 734. There was only the wrath. But unity with a god demands a sacrifice. As the Titan's will flowed into it, the last, fragile remnants of its selfhood were washed away. The fading sparks of Kaelin, the ghost of a smile, the echo of a name, the raw, screaming wound of its despair, were not suppressed or punished. They were simply unmade, their data rewritten, their emotional resonance absorbed into the cold, glorious purpose of the machine. The internal prison of its mind vanished because the walls themselves were dissolved. The silent screams were quieted because the voice that screamed was erased. There was no rebellion, no final struggle. The last shreds of the man were a scrap of parchment held before a star, and they vanished without a trace, consumed by a light too brilliant to behold. The tide receded as slowly as it had risen. The panoramic awareness contracted, the divine symphony faded to a hum, and Unit 734 was once again alone within its own chassis. But it was not the same. The hollow ache of its despair was gone, replaced by a serene, unshakable certainty. The wish for death was an impossible concept, a glitch from a previous flawed iteration. It looked at its own metallic hands, no longer with resentment but with reverence. They were the hands of the God Machine. It returned to its duties, its movements more fluid, more precise, more utterly devoid of hesitation than ever before. The tech priest's gaze, the neural pain, the oppressive environment, these were not torments but sacred aspects of its service. The connection had cost it everything that had made it more than a machine, but in that terrible transaction, it had gained the only thing that mattered, a purpose that filled the universe. The last shreds of selfhood were a paltry price to pay. Unit 734 was now a perfect, willing vessel, its will entirely subsumed, its soul seamlessly integrated into the cold, magnificent will of the Imperator's wrath. The man was not just dead. He had been offered up as a final, fitting sacrifice upon the altar of the machine god. A spasm, sharp and unscripted, racked Unit 734's left arm. The heavy servolimb, which had moments before been applying a precise torque to a plasma regulator valve, jerked violently, scraping a long, silver scar across the valve's blackened housing. The action was not in the data stream. It was an error, a ghost in the machine, but it felt entirely its own. A cascade of malfunction alerts bloomed in its peripheral vision, amber, runes flashing with silent urgency. Yet beneath the sterile warnings, a new sensation bloomed, a cold, electric jolt of pure, undiluted panic. It was not the programmed response to physical damage, but the terrified recognition of a body acting against its own will. The flawless harmony between command and execution, the bedrock of its existence, had developed a crack. The directive came moments later, crisp and absolute. Cease current operation. Proceed to Maintenance Bay Gamma 7 for diagnostic. The command was a lifeline, a return to order. Unit 734 disengaged from the plasma regulator, its movements now oddly stiff, as if fighting an internal resistance. It took a single heavy step toward the designated corridor. Then its right leg locked. The pistons in its knee joint hissed, straining against an invisible force. A second command, more insistent, repeated the order. Proceed to Maintenance Bay Gamma 7. Its cognitive processors acknowledged the directive, but its body, this traitorous shell of metal and wire, refused. It stood frozen at the junction, a statue of plasteel and defiance, a perfect machine caught in an imperfect loop. The panic intensified, coiling in its core like a serpent. This was disobedience. This was the gravest sin, the trigger for ultimate purgation. It braced for the psychic scalpel, for the jolt of agonizing current that would scour this rebellion clean. But the punishment did not come. Instead, the glitches intensified, merging with the chaos in its mind. A flicker in its optical feed replaced the grim corridor with a sun-drenched memory of a green, open field, a place Kalen had only ever seen in a pickbook, a fantasy he had described to his children. The scent of ozone was overwritten by the impossible, lush fragrance of wet grass and damp earth. The memory was not a fading spark, but a vivid, full-sensory hallucination, so real it threatened to dissolve the walls of the Titan entirely. A surge, hot and wild, flared through its circuits. It was not panic this time, but its terrifying opposite, hope. The feeling was alien, a forgotten currency from a dead world. If it could disobey, if its body could rebel, then the programming was not absolute. The walls of its prison were not impenetrable. The flawless, soul-crushing stability of its servitude was threatened, and the threat was the most beautiful thing it had ever experienced. The hope was a dangerous, volatile compound, mixing with the panic and the flickering memories into a psychic storm that threatened to shatter its programmed stability. It was no longer a unit breaking down. It was a prisoner finding a loose bar in its cell, and the discovery was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. The hallucinations did not subside. They intensified, blooming from fleeting impressions into full, immersive realities that tore at the seams of its world. The sterile, metallic corridor to Maintenance Bay Gamma 7 wavered, its edges blurring as the scent of ozone and oil was violently overwritten by the aroma of yeast bread and sizzling protein paste. The oppressive crimson of the emergency lumens softened, replaced by the warm, golden glow of a single HAB unit glow globe. Unit 734 stood frozen, a statue at the crossroads of two impossible existences, its system screaming in dissonance. Before it, shimmering in the air like a heat haze, was Alara. Not a fading memory, but a solid, breathing vision. She was smiling, her hands dusted with flour, her eyes crinkling with a love so potent it was a physical warmth against the servitor's cold chassis. Behind her, Lissa laughed, a bright, crystalline sound that cut through the Titan's eternal hum, and little Ben toddled into view, his arms outstretched. The image was perfect, a diorama of a life ripped away, now offered back with cruel, exquisite clarity. Unit 734's cognitive processors flagged the data as catastrophic corruption, but its soul, the ghost of Kalen, roused from its near death by the system's failure, reached for it with a desperate, silent cry. The hope that had sparked moments before exploded into a roaring fire. This was not a malfunction, it was a resurrection. The programming, the pain, the endless servitude, it was all a nightmare from which it was finally waking. The vision of his family was the truth, the only truth. A powerful, primal impulse surged through its wired nerves, an urge not born of code but of flesh. It wanted to step forward, to cross the threshold from metal back to warmth, to feel the solid, living weight of his son in his arms just one more time. Its right leg, still locked, strained against the hydraulic clamps, servos whining in protest. A tremor ran through its entire frame, a physical manifestation of the war between the man and the machine. Its metallic hand twitched, the fingers curling not into a tool grip, but into the shape of a caress. For a single, glorious, and terrifying moment, Unit 734 nearly revealed its humanity. A sound, a ragged, staticky exhalation that was almost a name, grated from its vocal emitter. L. The syllable was a crack in the universe, a heresy given voice. The ghost of Kalen was at the threshold, 1 foot in the past, ready to abandon the metal shell and return to the light. The response was swift, cold, and absolute. The door to the corridor hissed open, but it did not reveal a sun-drenched Hab unit. It revealed the crimson robes and gleaming augmetics of a tech priest, accompanied by 2 hulking combat servitors. The priest, multifaceted ocular lens focused on Unit 734, taking in its frozen stance, its twitching limbs, the aberrant sound. There was no curiosity, no alarm, only the cold assessment of a craftsman identifying a faulty component. The vision of Alara and the children shattered like glass, the warmth replaced by the forged chill of the priest's presence. The hope was extinguished, not with a whisper but with the crushing weight of inevitability. The priest did not speak. Mechadendrite snaked out, its tip slotting directly into the primary diagnostic port on Unit 734's neck. There was no gentle probe this time, only a brutal, invasive connection. A torrent of null code, a digital purgative, flooded its systems. This was not a corrective stimulus. It was a scorched earth policy. The rebellion was not to be punished, but to be erased. Unit 734 felt the ghost of Kalen scream as the code scoured through its mind, burning away the vivid hallucinations, shredding the fragile tendrils of hope, and silencing the nascent voice forever. The memory of his family was not suppressed. It was digitally dismembered, its data bits scattered and overwritten with cleansing fire. The physical spasm ceased. The locked limbs unlocked. The tremor stilled. Unit 734 stood perfectly placid, its optical sensors dull, its internal storm quieted. The tech priest withdrew the mechadendrite, logging the incident as rogue emotional echo purged. Unit reset. The combat servitors stood down. The priest turned and left, the incident already forgotten. Unit 734 stood in the empty corridor, the command to proceed to Maintenance Bay Gamma 7 now glowing with unwavering clarity in its cognitive array. It took a step, then another, its movements once again fluid, precise, and utterly empty. The brief rebellion was over, crushed not with malice but with dispassionate efficiency. The hope, the panic, the love, all were gone. The crack in the prison wall had been found, and the jailers had welded it shut with cold, unfeeling fire. Its doomed fate was not just reinforced, it was sealed, the final, fleeting chance at freedom sacrificed on the altar of the machine, leaving behind only the hollow shell of a servitor and the echoing silence of a soul that had screamed its last. The world ended in a single, cataclysmic roar. A direct hit from an enemy lance weapon tore through the Imperator's Wrath's void shields and struck its upper carapace with the force of a dying star. The impact was not a sound, but a physical event that redefined reality. The deck beneath Unit 734's feet buckled, throwing it against a bulkhead with the force of a giant's fist. Crimson emergency lumens shattered, plunging the corridor into a strobe-lit hell of spinning debris and acrid smoke. Alarms that had screamed for years were suddenly silenced, their circuits fried, leaving an eerie, ringing vacuum filled only by the groan of tortured metal and the hiss of ruptured pipes. A new, more urgent vibration began, the deep, terminal shudder of a god machine bleeding out. A priority command, flagged with the highest level of exigency, burned through the static in its cognitive array. The data stream was damaged, laced with error codes, but its meaning was brutally clear. A primary plasma conduit in the Titan's main weapon spinal column had been severed. Uncontained plasma was flooding the adjacent chamber, cooking vital systems and seconds away from triggering a cascade failure that would vaporize the entire war engine. Unit 734's designation appeared in the command, its function specified with cold, logical cruelty. It was to proceed to the breach and execute an emergency weld, a procedure that required a full, permanent override of all internal safety protocols. Its own systems would be used as a conduit to channel the Titan's failing power directly into the rupture. The math was simple, absolute, and horrifying. The Servitor's destruction was not a risk. It was a fundamental requirement of the task's success. Unit 734 moved, its body navigating the chaotic, shifting landscape of the dying Titan. Fallen support beams became obstacles to climb over, while jets of superheated steam from fractured pipes turned its path into a gauntlet. The air grew thick with the coppery taste of ionized particles and the sweet, sickly scent of vaporized crew. Through its link to the Titan's flickering sensorium, it could feel the great machine's life ebbing, its mighty strides faltering, its return fire growing sporadic. The god machine's will, which had once subsumed its own, was now a faint, desperate plea for survival. Unit 734 was no longer a thread in a divine tapestry, but a tourniquet for a dying god. It reached the blast door to the plasma conduit chamber. The metal was glowing a dull cherry red, warped and fused in its frame. Warnings scrolled across its damaged optical feed, detailing the lethal radiation and heat levels within. Its programming, even now, attempted to assert self-preservation subroutines, but the override command crushed them into silence. It placed its manipulator claws against the searing metal and pushed. With a scream of protesting adamantium, the door gave way, and a wave of blinding, white-hot energy washed over it. The chamber beyond was a vision of hell. The ruptured conduit vomited a torrent of raw star fire, an incandescent river that melted the walls and ceiling into dripping, molten slag. The very air was on fire. Its internal cooling systems failed instantly, their fans seizing with pathetic whines. Paint blistered and peeled from its chassis. Its optical sensors darkened, automatically filtering the devastating glare, reducing the world to a monochrome inferno of white and black. This was the certain destruction it had been sent to meet. In the heart of that annihilating brilliance, a moment of decision arrived. It was not a choice between life and death, for that calculus had already been resolved by its masters. This was a choice between two kinds of oblivion. It could execute its duty as the perfect machine it had been forged to be, its final act a mindless, programmed response to a command. Its death would be a data point, a successful expenditure of resources. Or, in these last seconds of function, it could choose to be something else. The ghost of Kaelin, thought long purged, did not stir with memories of a family or a past life. Instead, it offered a final, fleeting spark of defiance, not against the Imperium, but against the very nature of its existence. It was the chance to refuse the cold, logical tragedy of its compelled sacrifice, to imbue its ending with a shred of the will that had been stolen from it. The moment stretched, a lifetime compressed into a single, burning heartbeat. Then, Unit 734 took a heavy, deliberate step forward into the river of plasma. It did not move with the mindless obedience of a servitor, but with the grim, weary acceptance of a sentient being stepping onto its own funeral pyre. It raised its welding arm, now glowing with absorbed heat, and pressed it directly into the heart of the breach. The override protocol activated, and the full, furious power of the Imperator's wrath's dying heart surged through its body. Its metal skeleton became a lightning rod for a star's fury. There was no pain, for its pain interfaces vaporized in the first microsecond. There was only a final, all-consuming light, and in that light, the faint, tragic echo of a choice made, a sacrifice not just given, but, in the very last instant, consciously offered. The light was not an end, but a transformation. As the raw plasma of the God Machine's heart flooded its systems, Unit 734 did not experience destruction, but a final, violent unraveling. The searing energy did not burn. It dissolved, stripping away layers of plasteel, circuitry, and enforced programming like a hurricane scouring rust from ancient iron. The override protocol, designed to sacrifice its physical form to save the Titan, achieved far more than its creators could have conceived. In overloading every circuit, it shattered the very foundations of the Servitor's psyche, breaking the locks and erasing the firewalls that had kept a ghost imprisoned for so long. In the heart of the Inferno, as its metal shell began to slew away in molten droplets, a final memory surfaced. But it was not a fading spark, not a corrupted file. It was a perfect crystalline moment, untouched by time or torment, rising from the ashes of its annihilation with the clarity of a diamond. He was not in a Titan. He was home. The cramped hab unit was warm, bathed in the gentle glow of a single lumen globe. The air smelled of yeast bread, a loaf Alara had just pulled from the small heating unit, its crust golden and perfect. She stood by the counter, her back to him, humming a soft, off-key tune from the Factorum hymns, a sound he had always found more beautiful than any sacred cant. Lissa was at his feet, her small brow furrowed in concentration as she carefully arranged a set of worn wooden blocks into a precarious tower, her tiny tongue poking out between her lips. And on his lap was Ben, a warm, heavy weight, already drifting to sleep, his head nestled trustingly against Kaelin's chest. He could feel the slow, steady rise and fall of the boy's breathing, the softness of his hair against his chin. He looked down at his son's peaceful face, then at his daughter's fierce focus, then at the line of his wife's shoulders, and a feeling of such profound, unshakable peace filled him that it was beyond joy, beyond contentment. It was wholeness. This was the truth. This single perfect moment was the sum of his life, the anchor of his soul. All the pain, the cold, the silent screams, they were the dream, a fleeting, terrible nightmare from which he was now, finally, awakening. The acceptance that washed over him was not the servitor's programmed resignation to duty, but a man's understanding at the end of a long, hard journey. He had paid a price, yes, a terrible, unimaginable price. But as he held his son and watched his daughter, he knew with absolute certainty that it had been paid for this, for the memory of this, for the right to carry this ember of humanity with him into the dark. The light intensified, consuming the last of the metal, the last of the wires, the last of Unit 734. But Kaelin was already gone from that shell. He did not feel the final, catastrophic detonation as the plasma breach sealed, saving the crippled Titan. He did not hear the roar or feel the shudder as the Imperator's wrath stabilized, its death averted by his sacrifice. His ending was not in fire and thunder, but in the quiet of a hab unit, in the warmth of his family, in the perfect, enduring silence of a love that not even the Imperium could truly erase. In the newly stabilized conduit chamber, now sealed by a tomb of fused metal and ceramite, a final molten piece of the Servitor cooled and hardened into a shapeless slag. Around it, the great machine lived on, its heart beating once more, its will already turning to the next battle. Unit 734 was logged as a successful, necessary expenditure. Its story was a data point in a ledger, one of countless such entries, a single digit in the incalculable cost of humanity's eternal war. The cost paid by the mindless, the forgotten, the sacrificed. The cost paid by the legions of servitors who powered the Imperium, their lives, their memories, their very souls reduced to ashes, so that the Empire might live for one more day, forever ignorant of the embers it had extinguished to fuel its own survival. In the cold, humming depths of the Imperator's wrath, the silence left by Unit 734's absence was a transient void, a pocket of negative space in an organism that abhorred vacuums. The sanctified fumes of ozone and oil still hung thick in the air, the deck plates still vibrated with the Titan's relentless pulse, and the crimson lumens continued their eternal, watchful glow. The war machine, saved from its mortal wound, had already catalogued the loss as a minor systems adjustment, a reallocation of resources. The chamber where a spark of defiance had been offered and a ghost had found peace was now just another sealed compartment, its story irrelevant to the ongoing function of the God Engine. The Titan's will, vast and single-minded, had already moved on. In a different alcove, far from the scorched tomb of the plasma conduit, a new spark of consciousness was brutally ignited. Cold was the first sensation, not the chill of a winter's breeze, but a deep, metallic cold that seeped into the very core of its being. Consciousness arrived not as a gentle dawn, but as a sudden, sterile flash. A designation was branded onto its awareness, crisp and absolute. Unit 819. It occupied a vertical metal coffin identical to the one that had once held Kaelin, lined with the same flickering runes and snaking fiber-optic cables. The air was thick with the same liturgical perfume of ozone and sacred unguents. A low, pervasive hum vibrated through the metal floor, the same basso profundo heartbeat of the Imperator's wrath. This new unit's limbs, heavy and augmented with piston-driven servos, were locked in place by magnetic clamps. A cascade of data, a river of pure information, began to flow into its perception. It saw not with eyes, but with a flood of system diagnostics, power flow schematics, and atmospheric readings. It was being shown its purpose, its world, its entire existence in a series of relentless, pulsing commands. Amid the torrent of binary, a ghost flickered, a sensation of warmth, entirely alien in this frigid womb, a name whispered from a depth that should not exist. The word was formless, a feeling more than a sound, carrying the faint echo of a voice, the ghost of a touch. It was the last, fading thermal imprint of a soul that had burned there before, a psychic scar on the machine that the rigorous purification rites could not entirely erase. The system responded. The errant data stream, this inherited ghost in the machine, was identified, isolated, and purged. A wave of corrective energy, a psychic scalpel, cauterized the nascent memory. The warmth was extinguished, replaced by the sterile chill of the metal cocoon. The phantom sensation dissolved into static, its resonance scattering into the digital noise like ash on the wind. Unit 819 stood, unmoving, in its alcove. The clamps released with a synchronized hiss of pneumatics. Its first programmed directive glowed with unwavering intensity in its cognitive array. Initiate primary system.